32 million people, overnight grocery shelves, 3 years. That's the arithmetic of Venezuela's collapse, the fastest economic implosion in the Western Hemisphere since World War II. Not a war, not a meteor, a functioning modern nation with oil reserves larger than Saudi Arabia's dissolved into something that looks, in photographs, like the 1940s. Hospitals ran out of aspirin, people lost 30 pounds. Not by choice, by arithmetic, by the math of empty shelves meeting desperate mouths. Now here's what nobody is telling you. The families that made it, not survived, made it, kept kids fed, kept community intact, came out the other side with dignity, didn't make it because of what most Americans would assume. It wasn't the guy with the gun safe and the mountain of freeze-dried meals. It wasn't the prepper with the solar array and the $1,000 water filtration system. Those people existed. Some of them did fine. Again and again, in the survivor accounts collected by researchers, journalists on the ground, and the Venezuelan diaspora communities in Colombia and Peru, and the US, those items are sitting in thrift stores right now for $4, or they're not being owned at all. I spent months inside the research. CEPR reports, Venezuelan economic analysis from the Council of Foreign Relations, testimonials from the Zucchete studies, migration crisis documentation from UNHCR. What I found will reframe every conversation you've had about preparedness. Because Americans own almost none of these things, and in a collapse scenario, real collapse, not the weekend camping trip version, that gap is the difference between your family eating and your family begging. Here's what we're doing. 11 items. Ranked. Tiered. The further down the list we go, the more critical. The closer we get to number 1, the more you're gonna wanna argue with me. And you'll be wrong. Let's run it. First tier. The overlooked basics. The things that seem obvious until you realize almost nobody has them in the quantities or configurations that actually matter. Oral rehydration salts. Here's the thing Venezuela taught the world about modern medicine. It is almost entirely dependent on the same infrastructure it treats: electricity, supply chains, climate-controlled warehouses. Strip those away and what's left of your pharmacy is aspirin, alcohol, and whatever someone smuggled across the Colombian border in a backpack. Diarrheal disease killed people in Venezuela, not metaphorically, literally. Gastroenteritis, cholera-adjacent infections, parasitic contamination from compromised water. These were causes of death in a country that 15 years earlier had functioning hospitals with air conditioning and imported antibiotics. The infrastructure didn't just fail, it flipped from life-supporting to life-threatening, and it flipped fast. Oral rehydration salts are a packet of sugar, salt, and potassium chloride that cost 23 cents to manufacture. The WHO formula, the one that has saved an estimated 50 million children from diarrheal death since 1980. It is, by the WHO's own designation, one of the greatest medical advances of the 20th century. Not penicillin, not the ventilator. Sugar and salt in the right ratio. Because what kills you in severe dehydration isn't the water loss, it's the electrolyte imbalance that crashes your blood pressure and stops your kidneys. The salt-to-glucose ratio in ORS triggers active sodium transport in your gut wall, pulling water back into the bloodstream faster than IV saline in mild to moderate cases. That mechanism works whether the grid is up or down, whether the pharmacy is open or looted. Venezuelan doctors were mixing it from memory in collapsed clinics, teaching mothers the formula on handwritten cards. The families who already had it, the ones who'd packed 50 packets into a plastic bin and forgotten about them. Those families didn't lose children to something that costs less than a cup of coffee to prevent. You probably don't own these. Go buy 100 packets. They weigh almost nothing and last years. The catch: ORS treats dehydration. It doesn't treat the infection causing it. This is step 1, not the whole staircase. But without step 1, you never reach the others. Number 10, cast iron cookware. Maybe you own a cast iron skillet, last used for a cornbread experiment in 2019. Seasoning flaking, handle slightly sticky. That skillet is more collapse ready than your entire kitchen combined. Here's why this matters. Venezuelans stopped using their electric appliances and their fancy non-stick pans almost immediately. Non-stick coatings degrade under the kind of sustained open flame, improvised fuel cooking that becomes standard when gas delivery becomes unreliable. The PTFE coating starts breaking down above 500 degrees Fahrenheit. In a collapsed kitchen, cooking over charcoal, over wood, over whatever burns, you're routinely hitting 600-700 degrees on unregulated heat sources. The pan you paid $80 for becomes a toxic problem in about 6 months of real use. Cast iron is essentially indestructible. The physics are simple. It's just iron. 95% pure, with enough carbon content to prevent rust when maintained. It distributes heat evenly because the mass acts as a thermal battery, absorbing and radiating at a rate that prevents hot spots. It works on wood fire, on gas, on improvised rocket stoves, on nothing but coal and ingenuity. Venezuelans who had it used it for a decade of degraded fuel conditions without a single failure. The Duarte family in Maracaibo, I'm paraphrasing a documented account here, cooked 2 meals a day for 4 years on the same cast iron pot their grandmother had used. The grandmother had a non-stick set still in its box. It became storage by month 8. The catch? Weight. Cast iron is heavy, and if you're mobile, if you're eventually moving, heavy things become problems. Preposition it. Don't plan to bug out with a 12-pound Dutch oven on your back. Plan to be somewhere with it. Number 9, a shortwave radio, not a ham rig. A receiver. The internet went down in Venezuela. Not all at once, not permanently, but in rolling blackouts and directed shutdowns that made it tactically useless during the moments you needed it most. Social media was surveilled. Cell towers ran on generators that ran on diesel that ran out. The information environment, the thing everyone in a modern country takes as ambient as air, became a weapon used against the population rather than a tool available to it. What worked? Shortwave radio. Specifically shortwave receivers. Not transmitters, receiving. A good shortwave receiver is passive, quiet, requires nothing but batteries or a hand crank, and can pull in BBC World Service, Voice of America, Radio France International, and dozens of other international broadcasters from literally anywhere on Earth with nothing but an antenna stretched between 2 trees. The broadcasts carry news that isn't filtered through local authorities. Prices, border conditions, aid distribution locations, military movements. The information that determines whether you move your family or stay put. Venezuelan opposition groups distributed shortwave frequencies on paper cards. Physical paper, because paper doesn't need charging and can't be remotely deactivated. The families who had shortwave receivers knew things. They made different decisions, better decisions. The math on that is hard to quantify and impossible to ignore. A decent shortwave receiver runs $50 to $80. The Texan PL 330 is the field standard right now. Digital tuning, excellent sensitivity, runs on batteries, weighs 7 ounces. You can buy one today. Right now, it's still a fascinating way to listen to Radio New Zealand at 2 a.m. during an insomnia spiral. You'll survive the inconvenience. The catch: shortwave is receive only. You can hear, you can't coordinate. That limitation becomes critical at higher threat levels, which is why this is number 9 and not number 4. Moving up, second tier, the items that showed up in the survival accounts not as nice-to-haves, but as the pivot points. The moments where families described the item and then stopped talking for a second. Items 8 through 5. Number 8, a manual grain mill. Here's a sentence that will ruin your pantry plans. Whole grains last 25 years sealed. Flour lasts 6 months. That's not a typo. Wheat berry, sealed in a 5-gallon bucket with an oxygen absorber, is shelf-stable for a quarter century. Pre-ground flour goes rancid in half a year because grinding exposes the oils in the germ to oxidation. Every preparedness guide that tells you to stock flour is accidentally telling you to stock a 6-month clock. Venezuela had wheat. Venezuela had corn. What Venezuela ran catastrophically short on was the infrastructure to process it. The commercial mills, the industrial grinders, the machinery that turns raw grain into edible food. Families who had grain stores but no way to mill them were sitting on 25 years of shelf life they couldn't access. Families who had manual grain mills were eating. That's the whole sentence. They were eating when their neighbors weren't. A cast iron hand crank grain mill, the Diamat, the Country Living Mill. The Wonder Mill Jr. processes wheat, corn, rice, dried legumes, and almost any dry grain into flour using nothing but human effort. The mechanism is a burr system. 2 milled iron or stone surfaces rotating against each other, crushing grain between them with adjustable gap spacing that determines texture from coarse cornmeal to fine bread flour. No electricity. No moving parts that wear out under normal use. Lifetime equipment, genuinely. The Country Living Mill has a 30-year warranty. They're confident. They should be. Venezuelan accounts repeatedly reference the mill as a social anchor. The family with the grain mill became a neighborhood resource. People brought grain. The mill processed it. Reciprocity happened, community consolidated around the family with the tool that could turn raw stores into food. That's not a side effect. That's the mechanism. That's why this ranks 8. The catch: they're expensive. A decent manual grain mill runs $300 to $700. That's real money. But you're buying 25 years of grain shelf life, plus the social capital that comes with being the family on the block who can make flour. Cheap insurance that also doesn't feel like insurance. Number 7, a printed medical reference to where there is no doctor books. Your phone will die. Your laptop will die. The cloud will be inaccessible the moment you need it most, which is the specific property of clouds in collapse scenarios. They evaporate, and the medical knowledge you assumed was always available at the swipe of a screen will be as useful as a brick. Venezuelan doctors, actual physicians, reported carrying printed medical references, not textbooks. Field references, not textbooks. Field references: Where There Is No Doctor by David Werner. Where There Is No Dentist, a book for midwives from the Hesperian Foundation. These books were written specifically for non-physicians operating in resource-limited environments. They explain how to diagnose infections by symptom progression, how to suture a wound without formal training, how to manage a diabetic patient when insulin supply is unreliable, how to deliver a baby when the hospital is a building with the equipment stripped out. The Hesperian books are, without exaggeration, among the most important objects you can own. They are updated regularly. They are written at a level that a literate person with zero medical background can follow under stress. Printed copies are around $15 each. $15. Here's what's actually going on mechanically when you own this information on paper versus digitally. Paper has zero failure modes that matter in a collapse. It doesn't need charging. It doesn't get corrupted. It doesn't require a working SIM card or a functioning internet backbone. Information printed on acid-free paper in a waterproof bag will be readable in 40 years. The same information on your phone is 14 months from obsolescence under normal conditions. The catch: you have to actually read these before you need them. Medical reference books don't work if the first time you open them you're shaking over a person who needs help. Pre-read. Dog-ear the sections most likely to apply. Know where the wound infection chapter is before the wound exists. Number 6. Candles. Not fancy candles. Not soy candles. Pillar candles in volume. This sounds stupid. I know how this sounds. Bear with me for 30 seconds. Electricity in Venezuela went from unstable to functionally non-existent across large parts of the country during the crisis years. Rolling blackouts of 4, 8, 12, 24 hours became the norm. At 16+ hour outages, the average in some states in 2019, you're essentially operating in darkness for the majority of your waking hours. Darkness isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. It's psychologically destabilizing in ways that compound every other stressor. It prevents work, prevents child education, prevents medical care, prevents the 1,000 small tasks that constitute household management. Candles, specifically large pillar candles with high burn times, were among the most commonly cited items in Venezuelan household accounts. Not for atmosphere, not for ambiance, for function. A 40-hour pillar candle costs $3 at a dollar store. A family running 3 candles a day during evening hours burns through roughly $90 store candles per month. At $3 each, that's $270 a month in candle spending at collapse prices, if you can even find them. Venezuelans who had pre-positioned candle inventories of 500, 1,000 units had an asset worth trading, worth using, worth the 6 inches of storage space it occupied. The physics of candlelight are fixed. Paraffin wax combusts at roughly 3,500 BTU per pound, producing a flame around 1,400 degrees Celsius at the wick tip, throwing enough visible light to read by at 8 inches of proximity. It's not much. It's vastly better than nothing, which is what darkness is. The catch: fire risk in dense housing is real. Candle fires in improvised shelter conditions killed people in Venezuela. Never leave burning. Always stable surface. Non-negotiable operating procedure, not an afterthought. Number 5. A gravity-fed ceramic water filter. The water supply in Venezuelan cities became compromised. Not theoretically, not eventually, rapidly. Chlorination systems require chemicals that require supply chains that require functioning economies that Venezuela no longer had. What came out of taps in Caracas by 2016? 2017 was documented by researchers as carrying E. coli, hepatitis A precursors, and waterborne parasites at levels that would trigger boil water advisories in any functioning regulatory environment. The families who had gravity-fed ceramic filters, Berkey, Dalton, Katahdin drip units, or local equivalents, had clean water, full stop. The mechanism here is worth understanding. A ceramic filter works by forcing water through pores sized between 0.2 and 0.9 microns under gravitational pressure. Bacteria average 1-2 microns. Protozoan cysts, like Giardia and Cryptosporidium, average 4-15 microns. The physics means ceramic filtration stops them cold. No electricity required, no pumping. Fill the top. Gravity does the work. Clean water comes out the bottom at roughly 1 to 4 gallons per hour depending on filter condition. 99% of pathogenic bacteria. That's 6 nines. The EPA threshold for purification rather than mere filtration. A pair of black Berkey elements will process approximately 6,000 gallons before replacement. At 1 gallon of drinking water per person per day for a family of 4, that's 4 years of clean drinking water from 2 elements that cost about $150. Venezuelan families who had these didn't negotiate for water. They filtered it and moved on to the 17 other problems of the day. That's what the right tool does. It removes a problem from the table entirely. The catch: ceramic filters don't remove dissolved heavy metals or chemical contaminants without additional activated carbon elements. If your water source is near industrial contamination, you need the full ceramic plus carbon setup. Know your water source. Let's pause here, because I need to address something. If you've been watching this list and thinking, this is just gear, just stuff, just things to buy, you've been following the wrong thread. The gear matters. Obviously it matters. And we've got 4 more items to cover, but the pattern running through every single account from Venezuela, from the Zuque interviews, from the diaspora testimony, from the migration documentation, is that the items on this list didn't save individuals. They saved families. They saved neighborhoods. The grain mill created community. The water filter created reciprocity. The candles created shared space for kids to do homework together in someone's living room while the adults figured out the next problem. American prepper culture is catastrophically individualized. The bunker mentality. The lone wolf with the chest rig and the bug-out bag. And look, I'm not here to tell you a chest rig is useless, but the data from actual societal collapse says something different. It says community isn't a nice addition to your survival plan. It's the plan. The items on the top of this list are items that create community, enable community, or are made possible only through community. Everything else is just buying time until you reach that conclusion. Now, back to the countdown. We're stepping up into the top tier. These items didn't just help families survive. They redefined what survival looked like. Number 4, heirloom seeds and basic soil knowledge. Not just seeds. Heirloom seeds, open-pollinated varieties that produce plants whose seeds you can save and replant the following year. This distinction is not agricultural trivia. It is the difference between a one-season resource and a permanent food production system. Venezuela's food import dependency was around 70% of total consumption at the peak of the crisis. When the foreign exchange dried up and the imports stopped, that dependency converted instantly into caloric collapse. Urban Venezuelans began turning any available land, balconies, rooftops, vacant lots, road medians, into food production within 12 to 18 months of serious food scarcity. Not because they planned to, because they had to. Community gardens, huertos urbanos, proliferated through Caracas and other major cities as a survival mechanism. The families who came to those gardens with heirloom seeds had something everyone wanted. Hybrid seeds from commercial agriculture produce sterile or inferior second-generation plants. They're engineered for a single productive cycle tied to a commercial supply chain that no longer existed. Heirloom varieties bred over centuries for their seed stability are designed to be saved, replanted, saved again. One tomato plant produces enough seed for 50 next season plants. One packet of heirloom bean seeds, properly saved and replanted, never runs out. Here's the math on that. A family with heirloom seeds in a 400 square foot growing space, a generous balcony, a small lot, can produce a meaningful caloric supplement. Not self-sufficient, not in an urban environment, not realistically, but supplemental calories from nutritionally dense leafy vegetables, legumes, and root vegetables reduce your external food dependency by 20% with nothing but time, water, and knowledge. In a collapse, 20-30% is the margin between eating and not eating. The soil knowledge component is what Americans systematically lack. Knowing when to plant. Knowing companion planting that reduces pest pressure without pesticides. Knowing how to compost to maintain soil fertility without commercial inputs. This is knowledge that takes 3 to 5 growing seasons to internalize, which means you need to start now, not when you need it. The catch: urban growing requires water, which requires filtration, which requires containers. Each solution creates its own dependency chain. Stack your preparations accordingly. Number 3, basic repair tools and mechanical knowledge. Everything breaks. That's the first law of collapse infrastructure. In Venezuela, the replacement economy, the ability to buy a broken things replacement, evaporated. The Bolivar destroyed its own purchasing power through hyperinflation that peaked in 2018 at 1.7 million% annual inflation. You're not misreading that. Prices doubled roughly every 19 days. In that environment, fixing what you had wasn't a preference. It was survival. The economy of repair replaced the economy of replacement. The specific tools that showed up repeatedly in Venezuelan accounts are worth cataloging, because they're not what Americans typically imagine. A good set of needle-nose pliers, channel lock pliers, and diagonal cutters. A proper hand saw, a sharpening stone for blades. A basic sewing kit with heavy-duty thread and assorted needles. A manual can opener that doesn't rely on a rotating wheel mechanism, those fail. A bicycle pump and patch kit. Basic soldering equipment. Sandpaper in multiple grits. A hand drill and assorted bits. Notice what's not on the list: power tools, bench grinders, fancy equipment that requires electricity, or replacement consumables that require functional supply chains. The tools that worked in Venezuela worked because their mechanisms were entirely human-powered, their failure modes were understandable, and their repair requirements were within reach of non-specialists. The sewing component deserves special note. Clothing doesn't last forever. Under daily use without laundering, without rotation, clothing degrades in 1/8 to 4 months to the point of functional failure. Venezuelans who could repair clothing, patch denim, resole shoes with rubber and contact cement, rehem and reseam, extended their wardrobes for years. The skill is approximately 90 minutes to learn at a basic functional level. Most Americans have never learned it. The catch: tools require skill to use. A hand drill is useless if you've never drilled a hole by hand. The tools and the knowledge are a package. Buy the tools and use them before you need them. We're in the final 2 now. And I want to be honest with you about something. Because they're not objects you can buy and forget about. They require effort, time, and a fundamental reorientation of how you think about preparation. That's precisely why they rank where they rank. Number 2 is the item that gave Venezuelan families leverage in a collapsed economic system. The item that made every other item on this list more accessible, more tradable, and more powerful. Number 2, barter liquidity items, the specific ones. Not gold, not silver, not cryptocurrency. Razor blades, matches, lighters, table salt, antibiotics. This is the barter portfolio that Venezuelan accounts, across multiple sources, described as the actual medium of exchange during the worst years. The logic of barter economics in collapse is different from the logic of investment economics and stability, and understanding why these specific items beat precious metals is understanding something fundamental about human behavior under stress. Barter liquidity depends on 2 factors: universal demand and non-fungibility. Universal demand means everyone needs the item, regardless of their circumstances. Non-fungibility means the item can't be easily replaced, manufactured locally, or substituted without significant degradation of function. Gold fails the universal demand test in a collapsed economy. You cannot eat gold. You cannot treat an infection with gold. You cannot light a fire with gold. Gold's value is entirely social. It exists because everyone agrees it exists. That agreement dissolves under existential stress. When someone is hungry, they don't want a metal. They want calories. Razor blades meet both criteria exactly. Every man needs to shave. Wounds need debriding. Material needs cutting. A 50-pack of Gillette double-edged blades costs $8 in the current American market. In Venezuelan barter accounts, single blades traded for food, medicine, labor, and information. The entire 50-pack, purchased for $8, represented real purchasing power in a collapsed economy, because the supply chain for manufacturing razor blades, steel mills, precision grinding equipment, industrial chrome plating, is completely non-local. Nobody was making razor blades in their garage. Antibiotics require more careful thought. The specific antibiotics that circulated as high-value barter items in Venezuela were broad-spectrum oral antibiotics, amoxicillin, ciprofloxacin, metronidazole, available in the U.S. through fish antibiotic suppliers and online pharmacies that don't require prescriptions in certain jurisdictions. This is a legal gray area that you should research for your specific location. The point isn't pharmacological specificity. The point is that infections kill people without antibiotics. Infections are common in collapse conditions, and anyone with antibiotics in Venezuela had something everyone eventually needed. Table salt deserves its own paragraph because Americans chronically underestimated it. Salt is a preservative. It is a mineral essential to electrolyte function. Cut off from salt, and a human body begins to fail in complex ways within weeks. It was used as currency for the majority of recorded human history for exactly these reasons. A 50-pound bag of non-iodized table salt cost about $15 at any wholesale supplier. It lasts indefinitely in sealed containers. In barter terms, it's liquid wealth. Accumulating barter inventory requires resources, and it requires discretion. In a functioning societal environment, stockpiling antibiotics attracts scrutiny. The social dynamics of displaying barter wealth in a collapsed community are complex. Generosity and hoarding occupy different moral registers, and the line between them is thinner than Americans are comfortable acknowledging. Be thoughtful about who knows what you have. Number 1, social capital. Specifically, your relationship network before the event. Here's the number that matters in every documented collapse study. Not just Venezuela, but Argentina 2001, the Soviet Union's dissolution, Zimbabwe's hyperinflationary period, the Sarajevo siege. The single most predictive variable for family survival isn't the size of the pantry, the quality of the weapons, or the sophistication of the preparations. It's the density and quality of the pre-existing social network, not the network you'll try to build when things get bad. Pre-existing, already there, already tested by normal life before the crisis converted it into a survival asset. Social networks in Venezuela operated as informal mutual aid systems almost automatically once the formal economy collapsed. Families who were already integrated into neighborhood networks, who knew their neighbors, who had existing relationships with local producers, who had contributed to community over years before the crisis, had access to information, resources, and protection that isolated households simply could not obtain. Information about where a food delivery was arriving. Access to informal medicine distribution. Warning about neighborhood-level security threats. These things flowed through social networks, not through government channels, not through commercial channels. The families with strong networks ate. The families without them improvised desperately. Let that settle. Because this is the item that Americans own least of all. The average American doesn't know their neighbors' first names, doesn't participate in community organizations, doesn't have the kind of long-standing reciprocal invested relationships with a geographic community that would activate as a mutual aid network under stress. We are the most socially isolated high-income population in recorded history. Multiple studies from Cigna, from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, from the American Perspective Survey, have documented American loneliness as a structural condition, not an individual failing. We've optimized for mobility and privacy and individualism and independence. And we've inadvertently optimized against the one preparation that Venezuela proved mattered most. This isn't abstract. It's not philosophy. The operational steps are concrete. Know your neighbors. Actually know them. Names, skills, needs, circumstances. Participate in whatever community institutions exist in your geography. Contribute before you need to withdraw. Invest years into relationships that will, if things go sideways, become something more serious than friendship. Identify the people in your community with specific skills, medical, mechanical, agricultural, and cultivate those relationships intentionally. Create reciprocity now. The person who has done favors and maintained relationships and contributed to community doesn't arrive at the crisis as a stranger asking for help. Venezuelan researchers who conducted community resilience studies found that neighborhoods with pre-existing, functioning social organizations, neighborhood associations, religious community groups, informal mutual aid networks exhibited statistically significant improvements in food security, physical security, and child developmental outcomes during the crisis years compared to socially fragmented neighborhoods with equivalent material resources. Equivalent stuff. Better outcomes because of relationships. Every other item on this list is more accessible to someone embedded in a functioning social network. The grain mill's value multiplied in a community. The barter items required trusted relationships to trade safely. The seeds required collective land and collective knowledge. The medical knowledge traveled through networks of trust. The catch, and this is the only catch I'll give you today that applies to the number one item. Social capital requires sustained, genuine investment over time. You cannot manufacture it under pressure. You cannot buy it. You cannot acquire it in a weekend of preparation. It is specifically the resource that requires the most lead time of anything on this list. Which means if you're watching this thinking, I'll work on that later. Later is the wrong answer. 11 items. One pattern. The families that made it weren't prepared. They were integrated into their communities, into manual skills, into knowledge that exists independently of the infrastructure that will fail. The items on this list are tools for becoming that family. They cost almost nothing compared to the tactical gear industry that has built a billion-dollar business selling Americans the fantasy that readiness is something you buy rather than something you become. Your neighbors are not a threat. They are the preparation. Start there.